What's up, E39 Source? Ryan Schultz here with my 2000 BMW E39 M5, which is not the subject vehicle for today's video. It's currently December of 2020, but about 2 years ago, my good friend Nate here in Southern California came in with his 2001 M5. You may remember the video. We drove that car across the country on the southern route about a little over 2 years ago now. He got some miles on it here in California, and then the engine started making some very unpleasant noises. So we figured it was the connecting rod bearings. So we set out to make the rod bearing DIY. And unfortunately, it's not presenting itself today as a complete start to finish rod bearing DIY, because as we got in there and took the caps off the bottom of the connecting rods and found that cylinder 3 had a totally spun connecting rod bearing, it unfortunately took the crankshaft with it. So that ended up turning into a complete engine rebuild, which we're not going to do a DIY on at this point in time. So this video will show how to access the connecting rod bearings, how to remove the upper and lower oil pans and the pumps and the wiring and the front subframe and the suspension and all of the things required to access those connecting rod bearings. So now prepare yourself for E39 Source headquarters here in Southern California 2 years ago, with completely empty shelves and a young Ryan and Nate doing a big project. Ryan here with E39 Source. Welcome back. Today's focus car is Nate's 2001 E39 M5. And we're doing a fun one today. Nate, are you ready?
Oh man, yeah, I'm ready.
What are we doing?
Rod bearings.
Rod bearings. It's not the proper source for E39s until we do rod bearings. So we're diving in today. This car has
64,200 and something miles.
164, so a little bit premature.
It is rod bearing failure. It's not rod bearing preventative maintenance.
It's rod bearing failure, yeah. Do not ask a million questions about how do I know. You know. Yeah, you know. It's not like, oh, is that my rod bearings? No, you know, it's your rod bearings. It's at idle you hear a lot of
noise.
Right.
You know.
So the obvious here, you need a lift. Safely suspend the car. You need a lift. I mean, you could do it on jack stands, but good luck. So lift, safely suspend the vehicle. Remove the front wheels. They're 5 17mm studs. Then we need to remove some of the underbody trim here. So this is the primary belly pan, and they're just quarter turn Phillips screws. So just pull straight out, Nate. It's sandwiched. Just pull it. It'll go.
There we go.
Yep. So they're 5 quarter turn Phillips screws. That's it. You don't need to take them out. They stay in. Might be 6 or 7 of them, but they come out. Then back here behind that pan, you have your transmission pan. I call it the Patrick Star because that's what it looks like, and it's 5 or 6 more quarter turn Phillips. So remove those, and we have beautiful access to the entire undercarriage here, the transmission, obviously the oil pan. This is where we're going to be working today. So a brief overview. We need to drain the oil since we're taking off the lower pan. So we're going to drain the oil, we're going to take off the lower pan, we're going to take off the upper pan.
Front subframe to get the upper pan out.
Front subframe has to come
which
out.
Which means all these sway bar pieces, everything has to come apart, which will be fun.
So the oil pan drain bolt is a 13mm. You remove that, obviously, have something to catch it. Expect the capacity to be 7 or 8 liters. It's one of those. And taking a look at the pooling oil here, I don't know if we'll see it on camera.
But it's definitely sparkly.
We can absolutely see some sparklies in there, which is indicative of flakes of worn copper from the rod bearing shells themselves.
Aluminum, copper, and lead, I think.
So as the oil drains, we're going to prepare for front subframe removal, and some of the bolts are obscured. So we come back here, and there's these little pieces that fit in the side, and his was damaged. So I actually have one off the Sterling parts car that I'm going to get for him, but it's just this piece. It comes out with a plastic pop rivet here, an 8mm bolt over here,
and a Phillips screw,
over there if yours isn't damaged.
Kind of tucked in.
You may need to loosen this piece of trim as well, which is just an 8mm and an 8mm. And this one's a 10. The rusty one there's a 10. And you would just slide that down, gain access to that. So that gives us access here to this 18mm bolt. There's 6 bolts that hold the front subframe into the chassis. So, and it's going to be symmetrical. So I'm going to show you the 3 on the passenger side. So there's one here. And if you go to your tie rod and look straight up, it's inside that bore right there. There's another 18mm. And then all the way in the front, right next to the motor mount, is your third 18mm. Also, your headlight level sensor is attached to the front subframe as well. And excuse the lighting, but it's the thing here with the swivel arm on it. So note, this is the proper orientation for reassembly. It goes off towards the back of the car, not towards the front. It won't work if you put it towards the front. What we're probably going to want to do is just release the arm from the control arm here. And it's got this little bracket. They're a little tricky. I like to use some channel locks on them or something like that. And you basically just pry this tab away, and then the whole thing snaps off, and you can remove the electrical connector up here and then just leave it on the subframe. That's going to be the easiest way to go. Moving forward towards front subframe removal, we're going to go ahead and disconnect the sway bar at all of its attachments. So the sway bar end links attach to the sway bar right here. This is a 16mm nut. You counter hold the back of it with a 16mm open-ended wrench. Take those nuts off, push them outside of the sway bar, and then just put the nut back on, slide the whole thing out of the way. It's a good time to replace this thing too. If yours are bad, you're already halfway done. I did the same thing on the other side. Now you've got 2 13mm nuts holding on the brackets that hold your front subframe in. So we've removed the 2 13s here, the 2 13s over there at the front sway bar. I misspoke there. So we've got those out of the way. Some PB Blaster is going to be your friend. This was a Chicago car, so it's got a little bit of crust under here. After we drain the oil pan, we put the bolt back in just so we don't lose it. Next up, we're going to disconnect the wishbones and the traction struts. They're tension struts and traction struts, the front control arms. There's a total of 4, 2 on each side. We're going to disconnect them from the subframe. So we've got a nut on this side, a bolt on the back side. This is your wishbone, and then we move towards the rear of the car. These are huge. They're a little tricky to get to. This bolt goes all the way through. So we'll get you sizes on that in a minute, but we only need to disconnect them from here. Then we can let them hang from the spindle wheel carrier. The wishbones here come out of this front subframe really quite easily. So it's a 16mm the 16mm bolt head, and then the nut is an 18. So just put a wrench on the bolt, and then we've got impact tools here, so that helps a ton. If you have air tools, electric, whatever, you can do it by hand. It'll just take longer and some more energy. Spin the nut off. You slide the control arm out of the subframe, swing it over here, put the bolt and the nut back through so you don't lose it. We did the same on the other side. Now focusing on the front rear control arms, if that makes sense, the other ones, the big ones.
Or the traction strap.
We're going to use a 21mm counter hold over here, and we can't get air tools in there, so then we have a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, and you remember what socket's on there?
21s.
Yep, 21s on both sides. And that'll take a couple minutes to spin that nut off. So, tie rods. Tie rods need to be disconnected. Tie rod ends, ball joint ends, need to be disconnected from the wheel carrier. If yours are new or have recently been out, this will be easy. If not, like us, prepare to spend some time. So we ended up going to Harbor Freight. We picked up a ball joint separator.
Which is the 3/4 inch Pittsburgh forged ball joint separator. Don't bother going to AutoZone. That tool doesn't work for crap. You need this arc here, because what happens, you just put this on the carrier right here, and the ball joint, and then we just put an impact driver on it. You can do this with a wrench. It just takes time and a little bit of force. I recommend a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, because it's going to take a minute. This is a 3/4 inch socket. 19mm works just as well, and it pops, and it's going to just keep tightening and tightening. You're going to get it really tight, and then it's going to go bang, and it's going to shoot down. And we have the nut in place with this washer so it doesn't fall down and go flying across the shop floor.
Yeah, so do that on both sides, and it's fun. It makes a lot of noise. And at this point, there's really only we took some of the bolts out. We already talked about those 6 bolts. We've got all of them loose. They're just kind of hand tight, holding it in there. And now we look up here, and we need to disconnect where the steering box servotronic would plug in, and it's right next to where your brake pad wear sensor and ABS wheel speed sensor plug in. It's this plastic little box mounted to the chassis. It hinges open like that, and then you see a blue and a white connector in there. The blue connector is your wheel speed sensor. The white connector is your steering servo. So peel that out. It's got two little tabs at the bottom. You press the tabs in, pull the connector out. Now we're ready to drop the subframe, which is going to be fairly heavy, seeing that the steering box is still installed in it, including the center drag link, the idler arm, the pitman arm. We haven't touched any of that. We've just taken the tie rods off of the spindles, and try not to spin these. In fact, don't spin those because that will alter your alignment. We need to disconnect the steering box from the column. So being this an M5, the 540 would be the same thing. Steering box is right up here on the driver's side. You can see the splines. There's a 13mm bolt. You'll have to orient the steering wheel in the right position so you can see that bolt and have access to it. It came out pretty easily. Once you do that, then you can use a pry bar, start prying the steering column off of the box. I don't know if it makes any difference, but I went in the car and telescoped the wheel all the way out towards the rear of the car. You can kind of get your hands in there once you remove this piece of heat shielding. It's held in with 3 or 4 8mm bolts, 1, 2, and 3 of those. It wiggles out, and then I found that you have the best access standing here under the transmission. You can get both hands up in there, and with the help of some prying, you can wiggle it out and back, and then it does eventually come off. So the problem with prying it is it tends to bind. It doesn't come out straight and it binds. You have to bring it to slide it completely straight off, not at any sort of an angle. So maybe rotating the steering wheel, pry from this side, pry from that side, rotate it 180 degrees, walk it out that way. And once we kind of got it off, there's kind of 2 rows of splines on this thing. And once you get it off that first row, then your hands work to just wiggle it off. So now that that's disconnected, we can move on to the power steering lines, which I think we're gonna try to do from the top.
Quick note about the steering wheel though, do not just spin the steering wheel around in circles once it's disconnected. You will destroy the clock spring doing that.
Now it only goes on one way. The column only goes on one way on the box.
All right, so with the steering column disconnected, we're going to disconnect the lower reservoir line that goes out of the power steering pump, or excuse me, in where the fluid flows into the power steering pump, drain it. The high pressure line that goes to the steering box on this banjo bolt, that's a 22mm bolt, drain that. We're going to disconnect the power steering cooler lines, which is a 13mm bolt that runs right through here, and it goes up into the side of the radiator right there. We found that far easier to remove with the left airbox pulled out so we could clean it, or clear it, even though that was annoyingly tight. Quick tip, this lower line is going to keep dripping fluid constantly. Unless you want to constantly have a drain pan here, take the cooler bolt, wrap it in paper towels, and shove it in there, and it should stop most of the drips.
So we suspend the engine like this. This is just a Pittsburgh from Harbor Freight 1,000-pound capacity engine support bar. About $100, maybe a little more. And we're only going to use the one support. The transmission brace is going to act as the rear support. From the front here, we use a piece of chain. Obviously make sure that's rated at least 1,000 pounds as well. And then the hook we're using is on top of the alternator, below the Vanos unit, and behind the upper radiator hose. We have an eyelet connector rated at 4,000 pounds through there, threaded into the chain. The chain comes up here around the hook, and then you tighten this gigantic wing nut on top. Now Nate has the great idea. We put a little cloth over that and then lower the hood so there's no chance that the hood falls and you punch a hole in your hood, because that would suck. And then we did remove the intake tube here. It's a Phillips head band clamp, or a 6mm. The MAF wire attaches to that, and then the MAF went into the airbox that you probably already removed when you did the power steering line right there. And the MAF is, or the airbox here, is just held in with one 10mm bolt there after you release the 4 clips on top. And then we put a towel here just to reduce chafing on the radiator hose. Removal of the front subframe is an absolute joy. Leave yourself some time. The only modification we kind of had to do here is bend these small tabs that are on the brake duct housings here. Just bend them out of the way. It's aluminum. They'll bend all day. Oh, not those. These. Yeah, they'll bend all day. Just bend them back when you put it back together.
We had to remove this left engine, or the left engine mount relative to the driver's point of view. So because the power steering line sits on top of it and was pulling on the entire engine with the weight of the subframe, which we didn't really care for. So it was a complete pain, but we got a 16 mil up here, got it loose, worked it off. As soon as it was off and this mount fell out, the whole thing basically fell out.
Right. So we used a transmission jack on the floor, lowered the car, and raised a jack up to it. With the steering box and the tie rods and the front sway bar in there, It's not terribly heavy, but we were just a little bit more comfortable with that. It's a lot heavier on this side. The steering box by far is the heaviest component on there. And as you can see, we left the lines, the banjo bolts on top of the steering box. We left that passenger side heat shield in place. The idler arm and pitman arm are still in place, and the tie rods are still, the outer tie rods are still connected to the center, just dropped out of the front ball joints. And then
So the alignment won't be completely screwed.
that white wire is the servo that we talked about before. So now with all of this down, we finally get a good look at the bottom of the oil pan, a good unobstructed view. So we need to remove the lower pan as well as the upper pan. There's a couple of electrical connections we'll need to undo. Speaking of electrical connections, this large wire here was tucked in to the back of the front subframe, just in some little C-shaped clamps. Just pry it out, make sure you don't snag it when you're pulling it down. This is your main power harness for your charging port, power up there, alternator and starter motor. But the electrical connections here on the pan, so we have one for the temperature and level sensor, which is the lowest sensor on the pan. Then we have two more, one on each side, for your oil scavenge pumps. And they just have a little tab you push in and wiggle the connector off. There'll be another one over here on this side that is much better lit, Nate, if you want to disconnect that one.
Push the little thing in and press straight up. Super easy.
And do we have any other electrical connections that we'll have to mess with? I noticed there were some over here where the starter motor is. The starter motor connector is actually mounted to the upper oil pan. So it's just one of those turn connectors that we have to turn at about 45 degrees.
It should pop straight
and it'll pop right out. So I took those wires out of the little housing. Then, is it this way?
Yeah. Cool. There you go.
And it comes right out like that.
So here's a quick trick for keeping track of, there's, I believe, something in the order of 50 bolts holding this oil pan on, because the oil pan is actually a structural member on this vehicle. So as I'm removing a bolt, the moment after I remove it, I stick it in this piece of cardboard. So that way when I look at this cardboard like this, I will see an exact map of the lower oil pan bolts.
You could get a Sharpie too if you wanted to draw it out.
Label them, but this is pretty easy.
Lower oil pan comes down with just a ton of 10mm bolts, and really there's only a few that are longer, real easy to see, so you can see the wells that the short ones go into, and then over here there's like 4 or 5 long ones. So that comes down and out of the way. We talked about the wiring connectors, and now we need to remove the upper pan, and step one for that, at least for us here, was removing the power steering pump. So step one, it was a 14 or 15mm tensioner up here. This is the tensioner with the exposed nut there. So you just put a socket on a breaker bar, turn it, remove the belt. You can leave the belt attached to everything else, just remove it from the pump. Then there's a 10mm nut here, a 10mm nut here, and a 13mm bolt up here that hold the pump onto the upper pan and the alternator carrier, whatever we're going to call that. And then the pump comes off real easily, doesn't weigh very much at all, and we just put it down there. Nextly, to begin removal of the upper pan, we've worked from the back here. These are E12, external Torx 12 bolts. So we've removed a total of 4 of those. There's more up there. You don't need to remove those. Next up, I went and removed the AC belt. Same thing as the standard belt. It's a 15mm. You can use a wrench. I used a socket. Actually, I used a wrench, but you could use a socket on a breaker bar. Then, and only then, should you come down here and use a 13mm to remove this tensioner from the upper pan. And then we're just threading the bolts back in where they go. That's a lot easier to know exactly what's supposed to go where when you can just leave it in there. Then over here, there was a black bracket, 2 13mm bolts holding it to the upper pan, a long 13mm bolt holding it to the AC compressor, and yet another 13mm, this one a short one, back here behind the long one. So 4 bolts, the black bracket, looks like that, comes down. Now we move to the side. We unplugged them before. On each side of this engine is an oil scavenge pump. It's held in place with 2 10mm bolts. We've loosened the bolts, and now the pump is proving to be a little bit tricky to get out, but we'll get it. And then up top, there was a banjo bolt, size 19 mil. No oil came out of that. Yours might be different. Maybe hold a towel nearby, but remove that banjo bolt as well.
Note the 2 washers on either side of that banjo bolt. Don't lose them or replace them, or preferably replace them. I wouldn't recommend this professionally, but...
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, look at it. So don't do that. I mean, it works, but I wouldn't recommend it. So anyways, we basically had 2 small screwdrivers, and we were prying up on the edges of that. What I found the best way to do was to work it in its bore, just twisting it. Then I could get the little tabs out so I could pry on them. And then as you saw, it shot out the other way. But there is going to be some oil that squirts out according to BMW documentation, so just be careful of that. And if we look in here, and I take a little bit of clean paper towel, there's some interesting artifacts, I believe. You can see little pieces of copper right there. Oh man. So yeah, definitely some bearing or something has failed inside this engine.
So these are what come out of the sides. They've got 3 O-rings on there. Then you kind of give it a little twist and then pry it out, and hopefully it doesn't go flying across the shop floor. After both scavenge pumps are out, we can remove the smaller diameter pipe. It's one 10mm bolt that holds that on. We're kind of just putting everything in its own little storage bin over here to keep it organized. So there's two pipes here. The bigger one is right here. The small one, which I just showed you, was in there, about that angle. And next up, Nate, go ahead.
We got this little baffle plate, as BMW calls it. The 10mm here, and a 10mm back here. And I believe those both go into the engine block. So
2 more 10s, we'll get the baffle plate off.
Yeah.
So there's a cover over the chain and the sprocket on the oil pump here. It's held on with 4 8mm bolts. Those come off quite easily. And the next step is to remove this center bolt on the sprocket on the oil pump. It's a 16mm bolt. We try to wrench, it's pretty tight. We're going to put a 6-point socket on there instead. So when you get the 16mm nut loosened, you are then able to slide the sprocket off and out of the chain. Here we are with the oil pump out. It's held in with 5 fasteners. We have 4 Allen head 5mm. Those come out pretty easily, they're larger. And then the last one is another 10mm, and it's on this tube here. 10mm bolt on the tube, and then 4 6mm bolts holding the rest of this in. So this here is your tensioner. It's plastic. You're at this point, you need to be replacing the tensioner. And do have a catch can here because this is going to bleed for a while. And when we look up in there, we see obviously the chain. Now we're seeing some crankshaft counterweights, and we can even see the connecting rod caps for cylinders 1 and 5.
main bearing cap.
The upper pan comes down with a ton of 10mm bolts, and I think there were 2 13mm bolts too. So what we did was, obviously we're going to be replacing this upper pan to engine block gasket. So we took that piece of cardboard that came with the gasket, and with the gasket still on there, there's little holes in the gasket for all of the bolts. So you can just go through with a pick tool or a screwdriver and make a hole with where each hole goes, and then as you remove a bolt, stick it in the hole. And some of them come with a bracket, like right there. That's the bracket that held that wiring harness that plugs into the starter motor. So we just put the bracket there so we know exactly where it goes. Same thing with the bracket up here and this little bracket over here. So all of those bolts come down. You have to go up in these bores on the bottom of where the transmission mates to the lower pan. There's more 10s up in there. There's only 2 13s, and they're easy to see. They're right over here. And when we have the upper pan down, we're really looking at the bottom of the block. We're looking at the crankshaft, the caps for the connecting rod bearings.
Yep.
And Nate, why don't you show us
This is the culprit.
piston
right
3.
Piston number 3.
Piston 3 has play.
Not much of play.
None of these should have any play in them.
0 whatsoever. So we're going to take the cap off and look at the crankshaft and see if we're buying a crankshaft or not.
Yeah, the journal on the crank, where the rod bearings mate with the crankshaft, that's going to tell us if the crank is reusable or polishable, or where we're going to go from there. So those are E12 bolts, external 12s. They're the same ones that we removed on this side over here. There were 4 of them. So we're going to pop that off. Look at the crank.
So this is the remains. This is a spun. This is a classic spun connecting rod bearing. Now, and it should come out of the crankcase somehow. There we go. There's a snap.
So the bearing's not supposed to spin.
It's not supposed to spin within its connecting rod cap.
It's supposed to be justified to the cap on the bottom side, and then the bottom of the piston or the connecting rod on the top part.
It got hot. So all these black marks are where it's overheated. Right there. We will see. We'll take a look at the crankshaft and evaluate it.
And a note on the caps. These caps are actually broken off of the connecting rod. So you can't put it on backwards. You can't take a cap from cylinder 3 and put it on cylinder 7.
That would be a bad idea.
It has to go back on the exact same piston, connecting rod, in the exact same orientation.
Right.
And there's actually a little notch. Nate, if you want to hold it up like you had it there. There's a little notch, right, where are we? Right there. And when you look at your new bearings, they will have a little protrusion that fits in that notch. And the bearing is supposed to stay exactly sitting in there, not rotate.
Not like this.
Yeah, that's
how it came.
Spun bearing. We're approaching the end of day one, and our goal today is to get all of these connecting rod bearings out. Tomorrow we will come in and check the clearances using plastic gauge, install the new bearings, new gaskets, clean the surfaces. It's going to be very time consuming to put this back together. Yeah. The part that I am looking forward to the very least will be subframe reassembly, steering gearbox reassembly, that stuff. Nate's going to do that while I do other stuff. Really, you need to keep rotating the engine to gain access to the cap bolts here, and they're E12s. I think I mentioned that. Do not use air tools or impact tools. Use your hands, use ratchets, be careful, breaker bars. So you want to rotate the engine. Right up here by the harmonic balancer is a 32 millimeter
big ass
bolt, essentially. So unfortunately, I don't have a 6.32 mil, so we're using a 12. It's working. It's a little tough. You can hear the engine going through all of its strokes as that happens.
And exhaust, all that stuff.
So just keep rotating it, and then put it in one position. Take off all the caps you can. We have kind of adopted this little piece of cardboard over here, and then I've written cylinder 3. So we'll look at cylinder 1. So I have the piston bearing on top, then I'm putting the cap. That's the exact orientation, came off the car. Exactly. The passenger side is on the left, the driver's side is on the right. The bolts are in the right spot, and there's the cap bearing on the bottom. Then I'm going to do cylinder 2, piston bearing, cap, cap bearing. Cylinder 3, piston bearing, cap, cap bearing, and so forth, all the way down through cylinder 8. So we've done cylinders 1, 3, 7, and 8. We're finding that cylinder 3 was by far the worst. Yeah. That had completely spun.
Yeah, we've got to take a look at the clearances especially carefully on this cylinder tomorrow. There's the slightest hint of a lip here, which isn't great. And also, if you feel this, it's like glass. If you feel this, it's like glass, but with a little bit of etching on it. So we're going to have to probably polish that up with some emery cloth tomorrow. It's not bad, and it may just be bearing deposit material that we can actually clean off fairly quickly. So we'll go see what they say, if we can pick some up at a local auto parts store.
Welcome to day 2.
Alright, so we're going to be taking a look at the clearances on this rod journal, as it's called on the crankshaft. There is a slight ridge, which has me concerned that this crankshaft might be toast. However, to verify that, we are going to take a strip of wet-dry sandpaper, very fine grade. This is 500 grit. This is liberally coated and sprayed with WD-40 front and back. I'm going to wrap it around the crankshaft journal, sanding side down, obviously, so that we're sanding the crankshaft. And from there, I'm going to take a shoestring and wrap it around it multiple times, and then work it back and forth to create a round, even sanding motion on this crankshaft. I'm going to do that for a few moments, and then take it off and take a look and see what we've got going. And then after that, we get to inspect our crankshaft. I don't mind the rainbow sparkles. That's what Walmart had today.
It's the only flat shoelace
I could find. There was white, but I figured this is going to get covered in oil anyways, so. I don't mind the rainbow sparkle. Well, almost exactly 10 months later. This is the crankshaft we were just working on, and this is what is left of that crankshaft, I should say. So if you look at the connecting rod journal here, it's kind of hard to focus on, but if you look at this connecting rod journal, it feels like glass. Like, this is extremely smooth. Come down to cylinder number 3, and you can see the grooves and the finish there. If you touch it, you can feel it's just ever so slightly gritty, and don't know if you can hear that, but there is definitely a ridge there that you can feel with your fingers. Okay, and that ridge is not consistent all the way around. So at this point, we did put the connecting rods back together. We put the new bearings in the connecting rod, and then we measured the clearances of the connecting rod. We use plastic gauge to do that. I recommend Eric the Car Guy's video on how to use plastic gauge to check your rod bearing clearances. When I put it back together, the rod clearance on this side, perfect. The rod clearance on this side barely dented the plastic gauge. Okay, and at that point, I elected to rebuild the engine. Okay, I did that myself at E39 Source World Headquarters here in Escondido. Over the course of about 3 or 4 months, maybe even 5 or 6, I forget honestly at this point, it was a long time. To do so, we pulled the engine from the car. We pulled the engine from the car with Ryan's help. Ryan over there. But the car is back running after a healthy injection of cash and a ton of labor. It did take us quite a while to pull the engine out, especially because the engine removal was made more difficult because of the lack of any sort of oil pan or front subframe. If you're going to drop an engine out of one of these cars, generally you're just going to disconnect it from the drive shaft, disconnect the coolant hoses, drop the front strut towers, and drop the whole front subframe and slide it out just like they would on the assembly line. That would have been the easier method, but because we already had the front subframe out to do the rod bearings, it proved a little bit more difficult for us. We had to use a cherry picker and a whole lot more effort. But we got there in the end. The engine was rebuilt. The crankshaft was replaced with a used unit in nearly new condition. All the rod bearing journals on that one were perfect, and the engine was reassembled with new hoses, new bearings, new timing chain guides, new valve cover gaskets, new head gaskets. You name it, it was new inside the engine. If it was rubber or plastic, it was replaced with almost no exceptions there. So some resources that are going to be helpful for you if you're going to be attempting to rebuild your own S62 by yourself in either your shop or your backyard or your garage or whatever you have available to you. Obviously, if you have a lift and a nice space to work like E39 Source, it is going to be much easier for you. If you're looking for specs and DIYs on rebuilding procedures, there is the new TIS information available online. If you can go to websites like newtis.info, that will have a ton of mechanic-oriented guides for you. However, those are going to be using the BMW specialized tools. If you're going to be using the Bison's Vanos DIY, there's not going to be using specialized tools nearly as much, but you need to understand how this engine works, especially how its timing curve works, before you dig into this motor. If you get the timing wrong, you're going to send 8 pistons crashing into 32 valves, you're going to destroy your heads, blow holes in your engine block, and possibly even irreparably damage the Aliso liners. It is not for the faint of heart. This probably all in with all the plastic new parts, the timing chain guides, the tensioners, all of that probably set me back at least $5,000 to $7,000. Add in my time, and it was probably at least a $20,000 project. Just like any other rebuild on this car, it was going to be at a mechanic shop. This was very thorough. New bearings, new chains, new tensioners, new rubber, new plastic. Everything that was inside this engine is basically brand new, except for the block itself. The crank was used. And there were some issues with it. We did have to remove the transmission after it was installed to rectify a rear main seal that was not sealing and was pouring oil out around the crankshaft, which did necessitate the replacement of that pressure plate. You can reset the pressure plate, however, it is not a simple procedure to do so. And if you do not have the proper tools, it may go cattywampus on you. If you do have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. I, Nate, will try to answer them on my own time. You can look for my comments at the handle @Computinator. Same thing for Twitter if you have anything to tweet me directly. This is beyond the scope of what E39 Source is generally going to support. If you're going to attempt this project on your own, you're going to be doing so without direct support from E39 Source. We just can't take that liability here. But I am very grateful to this shop for lending me the space and the tools and the time and quite a bit of physical labor as well, because we are good friends, and I do very much appreciate that. This crankshaft did take us from Chicago to Ohio and back to California quite reliably, but its days as an S62 crankshaft are pretty much over. This will make a neat nightstand or lamp at some point in the future, maybe with like a pusher plate welded on and a bulb at that end, and maybe with a little lampshade, but it's got some stories to tell. If you own a car like this, I highly recommend that you join the E39 M5 owners group on Facebook. There are a ton of knowledgeable people like myself, Mikhail Epilev, Ryan Schultz, Adam Bajrak, and a few others, Shadi Hassan, and a few other people who have done work like this, Mike Galladay, you know, people that are very willing to lend their time and their advice into helping you rebuild your own engine. All that to say, it was a very expensive lesson. If you hear a rod knock, if you suspect your rod is knocking, or you don't know the maintenance history of your engine, I would expect you to be very cautious on an engine. Now, Ryan's car did 190,000 miles on its original engine, My car only got 164,000 miles. We were at 164,228 when the rod bearing spun. That probably was a combination of hard driving, went a little bit too cold because I'm new to this engine and didn't know that the engine was that sensitive to it. It was also run on 5W30 oil, as was recommended for these engines for many years. I only believe that the last 2 or 3 years of its life it was run on 10W60, and who knows, the damage may have already been done at that point. I would recommend anyone doing a rod bearing service should do so around 150,000 miles on these cars. If you drive an E90 M3, that's going to be generally about 75,000 miles, same with the V10. By 100,000 miles, you're definitely overdue on those. The S62 is generally a reliable engine, however it is a very complex engine with tight tolerances. It needs to be warmed up like a racing engine. It is based on a racing engine and was used successfully in the Turner Motorsports racing program for many years.
With that, we're going to give this thing a start up. Listen to a rebuilt S62.
Yeah.
It was quite good.
The mileage it was rebuilt at, it started at 164,228 is when it spun a rod bearing and ate up the crankshaft. It is now at 171 and change, 171,708 at this point, so it's been however many miles that is, a good distance of miles, 2 oil changes.
Enough to know if it's going to work or not.
It works fine.
And it does work.
Ready?
Yep. Fantastic.
Yep. Roars like a kitten, sounds good.
Sounds great. Makes tons of power. Ask us how we know. There you go. So obviously this video is not a rod bearing DIY. We didn't DIY how to remove the caps and remove the old bearings and plastic gauge the new ones and torque the caps to spec and angle torque and all that very sensitive, important stuff. And then reassembly, of course. So I'm going to let this video just go up on the channel and become kind of a supplement to somebody considering DIYing rod bearings. We did all the DIY to get there. If you think you can move on, great. This is just meant to be a supplement, and thank you for watching. Good luck, guys. Keep these things going.
So if you're looking for more detailed engine rebuilding content, you can look for Eric the Car Guy. Is actually a great resource to go to. He's built a couple engines as of late in his Fairmont project videos. You can look at those. You can also look at the ETCG, Eric the Car Guy, Dad's Truck series. He does a good job at rebuilding that engine as well and explaining how those processes work. You can also do videos from people like Jaffro Mobile. Jaffro Mobile has a guide series on rebuilding a Ford G63 Mitsubishi engine. Generally, engine building knowledge from other channels will apply to this as well. So if you're familiar with the content of those videos, you may feel more comfortable attacking this project on your own.